restrain himself? Thank you. I call Andrew Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure to be talking on the Overseas Investment Amendment Bill. And what a divisive issue this has been. I, like a number of us in the House, have sat on the Finance and Expenditure Committee, listened or received 213 submissions, heard 63 of them both in Auckland and Wellington. And, Madam Speaker, I've got to say it was almost an embarrassment actually being a member of the Finance and Expenditure Committee during the period that we heard this bill. And I think it's best characterised as one of those feel-good bills that parties like New Zealand First like to promote, because it sort of appeals to the general public that, yes, we've got to stop foreigners coming and buying, our assets. And then on the other side, having little regard to actually what that means and what the implications. And in life, it's always a balance. And I think, unfortunately, we've ended up with a very poor balance. And obviously what we've heard, that this bill is about seeking to place limitations on overseas persons from acquiring basically residential land and characterising as sensitive land. And there are three ways that they can obtain consent. I'm talking about overseas investors. That is, if they are in the business of buying the land and adding to New Zealand's housing supply, i.e. they buy the land, sit on it, develop it and then flog it. If they want to use the land for non-residential purposes or residential purposes relating to core business, i.e. it's a business you acquire which happens to have some residential land. And a case in point was telecommunications companies that were initially precluded, or residential retirement village type companies. Or the third one, if they hold an appropriate visa and show they had committed to reside in New Zealand. And the big issue was in allowing overseas persons to acquire residential land for the purpose of supply of housing. And one way, and we've heard from a number of people, the way the bill has been written, it has had a chilling impact on new developments already, even though the bill is still not even enacted. But it raised the question in the committee about what sort of land might an overseas buyer buy? So is it a residential piece of land, or is it land deemed rural residential, which is on the outskirts of, for instance, in Auckland, my electorate? Or is it rural land that could be bought and then subsequently reconsented and actually used to build property? And the question is, over what time period can you buy this land if you're an overseas person? And over what time period can you hold it? Can you be a land banker for a long, long period of time? Which is actually the issue around property development. If you want people to develop property, and if they're overseas people, if you really wanted them to develop property, Madam Speaker, you would have put time pressure on those foreigners to be able to do that.
The member go on a bit, but please don't bring me into the debate.
But this bill had nothing of that, Madam Speaker. The bill was silent on that, and it still allows for overseas people or persons to actually land bank, and that's one of the core issues why we've got a lack of supply in housing. And one of their changes was an exemption if the overseas person is buying it if you are buying and building a multi-storey apartment. And also, so the rule that was subsequently announced during the course of the hearings and the committee's work was that if you're building, you're overseas foreigner or overseas person, if you're building a multi-storey apartment with more than 20 units, you could offer some of those
I just remind the member, the use of the word "you" brings the speaker into the discussion. So if you could just not
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
That would be great.
So the developer, the overseas person, could sell those off the plan to overseas people, and up to, and we didn't get clarity around that, whether that was 60%, but we believe it could be up to 60% of the units could be sold to overseas people. And there were some exemptions around that, rented, share, equity schemes, whatever. But effectively what that allows is apartments to still be built and sold to overseas people. And what this raised is the issue around who might actually rent those properties or enter into long-term arrangements. And the rules around it is that they must be subject to a market rent on a proper basis. And of course, one of the things, and I think this is where the biggest hole is in this Act, or when it becomes an Act, is that a foreign person could develop apartments, then sell that to a family member under a market rent situation, and therefore still have control of that and still achieve the same outcome. And that issue was never actually resolved within the committee. And I think it's the one that cuts through and actually undermines the case of this Act. And if you were to actually be clear about it, you would have actually put a dent in that if you were trying to stop foreigners coming in and buying apartments. There were similar exemptions for hotel units. And one of the things we've asked, with all these sort of complex arrangements where foreigners are allowed to do these developments and have to sell it within a certain time period, and foreigners are allowed to buy these units, how on earth do you monitor that? And we spend a lot of time with the OIO asking that very question. And as my colleague Ian McKelvey noted before, at the moment the OIO only do a very, very small number of consents, about 150. But now they're probably estimating they're going to need or have to process about 4,000 a year. That is a phenomenal increase. And the whole issue about resourcing of the OIO is incredibly one that we could not get a view on it. We were told they were going to have some additional people, but it is a big issue and it's a complex issue. And it's not only at the time that these original arrangements come into place, but because they have transitional arrangements later on, how on earth is the OIO going to continue to monitor these types of arrangements and property and rental arrangements to make sure they comply with this bill? We also there was a step change during the bill. I spoke about it. At the moment, previously the bill envisaged that power, gas companies, telcos were all going to be excluded, who often have a requirement to buy residential properties for their own operations. And only through the process did the minister put in place a new change to give a dispensation to those groups, but ruled out a dispensation for retirement homes, because in many cases our largest retirement homes are owned more than 25% by overseas parties, merely because they're listed on the stock exchange. And there was no real reason why they were actually precluded. So the one that really worked us up as a committee was around the forestry rights. And as my colleague, Honourable Amy Adams, noted before, 72% of the forestry rights in New Zealand are already owned by foreigners. And yet we have a government who says that's not enough, and actually set about dismantling and making it easier and setting in place 3 easier steps for foreign forestry people to come in here and buy more of our forests. And there is no justification why we should allow more foreigners to own more than 72% of our forests. I heard the argument about trying to achieve our billion-dollar budget of new trees, but of course New Zealanders should be doing that. That's the New Zealand stuff. And why on earth would New Zealand First support foreigners increasing their share of forests in New Zealand? Absolutely, I cannot understand. And when on the other side we've got a viable vineyard, winery business in New Zealand, highly successful, and do you think there are any such dispensations for that? Not one jolt. Not one jolt, Madam Speaker. So some of the other issues were around the conveyancing of it. The conveyancing rules were actually very significant for people who had to do that, and through the work of the committee we reduced some of the liability so that now there's an obligation on the purchaser to provide a statement, which the conveyancer merely has to note and pass on, but the liability for making any false claims now sits with the foreign overseas party. And now that's another issue with the Overseas Investment How is it going to monitor that? How is it going to check it, given the significant scale of 4,000 consents a year? I do not support
apologise to
this.
the member. Your time has expired. I call Jan Tinetti.
Kia ora, Madam Speaker. It's a wonderful opportunity to stand